So welcome everyone to the second talk of Fashion Talks at AUP, entitled Between Despair and Hope, which is organized by my colleague Sophie Kurkdjian and myself. And we are thrilled to welcome today Caroline Evans to talk about her most recent anthology, Time and Fashion, which she co-edited with Alessandra Vaccari. Before introducing Caroline and her talk, just some practical points. So the talk is being recorded and it will be posted online tomorrow for wider and future audience. And please use the chat for any questions you may have for Caroline during the talk when they come to you, but we will have a dedicated question and answer session after Caroline's talk. So our lecture series this year is entitled Between Hope and Despair, and it's very fitting that we talk about time at this very moment. The fashion industry has been hit incredibly hard along the full human chain in the past year, and there's much talk about time, about unsustainable acceleration of fashion, about seasonality, about slowing down. And the fashion designer Iris van Harpen already in 2013 said, "Time is like a religion. Everybody just believes in it." So what is it that we believe in? How can we conceptualize time and fashion? And I'm thrilled that Caroline Evans will share her work and her insights with us today. Caroline is Professor Emerita of Fashion History and Theory at Central St. Martin's in London. And it's safe to say that Caroline is the most public and widely read fashion scholar. She's been called a major voice amongst fashion academics and a fashion intellectual, and she's really been instrumental in developing the discipline of fashion history and theory. She's published 7 books and over 40 scholarly articles in the field. Her research interests in her long experience of teaching in art schools, and her publications include Fashion at the Edge and The Mechanical Smile, and she's co-edited last year Time and Fashion, and today her talk will focus on 3 concepts that structure this book: industrial time, antilinear time, and uchronic time. A very warm welcome to you, Caroline, joining us from London. Thank you for being here today, and I will now share your presentation.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for that very generous introduction. I wondered, Renate, could you keep an eye on the chat box for me and just interrupt if someone says, "How do you spell that?" or whatever, because I tend to not see when I'm reading. It's really a pleasure to be with you all from your various countries across the world. I put together a PowerPoint which is a little on the long side, so I'm going to go quite fast through it, if that's all right with you, in order to keep time for questions at the end, and I might skip 1 or 2 slides. So we could open with the second slide, please. Next. The book that I worked on with my colleague Alessandra, who teaches at IUAV, University of Venice, came out of a residency that I did there, and I did it as part of my residency. So we, first of all, published it as Il Tempo della Moda in Italy in 2019, but I actually speak hardly any Italian, so we kind of started in English, and the book had gradually to drift into Italian when Alessandra had to really take over there. And then we did a second iteration of it in English for Bloomsbury in London. And that version actually has changed quite significantly, partly because the Bloomsbury peer reviewers raised certain issues that were very constructive for us to think about. So I would say, I don't know if any of you are native Italian speakers, but I guess I would slightly rather you read the English language one, because I think it contains more of our latest thinking. The main changes, the new book, by the way, which is kind of a mystery to me, this is it. It's actually thinner than the Italian book, and yet it's twice as many words. So obviously there's something going on there with the paperweight. Bloomsbury must have very fine paper. I think the 4 new differences, and I'll talk about a couple of these today, is one of the peer reviewers' constructive criticisms was that it was a very Eurocentric bias to our proposal. And in fact, what we tried to do was this made us really think of time itself, standardized time, as itself a Western-centric concept. And we tried to make that more explicit rather than simply implicit. And we also added in new categories specifically about women's time, queer time, and colonial time. So, sorry, moving on. I was meant to, next, please. These are just the book covers. I have to say the one on the right was not completely of our choice. So moving on again, please, next. We split the book into 3 sections: industrial time, antilinear time, and uchronic time, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. Of course, I won't talk about all the different authors, but I just wanted to show them to you so you can see in industrial time we start with Karl Marx. We have a range of writers, and next slide, please. You can see the writers we have in the next sections in antilinear and uchronic. The point I wanted to make is that we took a very interdisciplinary approach. So it ranges across, it's not just fashion studies, it ranges across philosophy, political economy, history, literature, media, fashion design, and only about half the texts are academic, and the remainder span a lot of different genres. So autobiography, journalism, web posts, press releases, fiction, and even an adjudication on a fashion advertisement by a UK government agency. So our 3 categories are what I will talk about next. We drew to a certain extent on the art historian Keith Moxey, who has written very interestingly about 3 temporalities in art. So he talks about chronology, heterochrony, and anachrony. So the first one, his category chronology, relates to our idea of industrial time, but Moxey is one of many people who's criticized this notion of chronology as being what he calls a motivated temporal trajectory whose significance is restricted to Euro-American culture. And his system, if you like, for opening up this concept to culturally diverse and subaltern histories is to add 2 other concepts of time: heterochrony, meaning many coexisting times, that has quite a lot in common with our idea of antilinear time, though it's not the same, and anachrony, meaning out of time, that is very, very relevant to uchronic time, which I will explain at the end, because everyone says to me I had to look up that word in the dictionary, and we do know that, so we'll come back to it. But the key points about Moxey's tripartite division of time is this: that his account begins with a critique of the Western-centric notion of chronological time. And of course, this is a criticism that has also been leveled against the Eurocentric definitions of fashion that have until recently dominated fashion studies. So next slide, please. So I just wanted to make a few introductory points about that before moving into industrial time. Next, please. So I love this picture, and we weren't able to have any pictures or many pictures in the book, but I have since written an article about it in an online magazine called Guernica, so you can Google it and find it there. The key points really that I wanted to make about time is that Western, or now international, time was standardized only in the 1880s. And this is absolutely crucial to the development of modern fashion. So there's a lot of writing about how it systematized, railway timetables across Europe, for example. But it also has very important ramifications for international trade, including the trade of fashion, which is what I wrote about a bit in the Guernica article. Next slide, please. So rationalized time was first standardized in 1884 at the International Meridian Conference in Washington, D.C. And it's on the basis of Greenwich Mean Time, and then agreed by the Western powers in 1913, when the Eiffel Tower sent the first signal transmitted around the world. There's quite a lot of jockeying, actually, between the French and the English in this period of empire about sort of ownership of time and who's going to get the top spot in terms of, whose measurement system is going to be adopted. But what you really see here is the idea of time as a commodity and time linked to commodity culture. So we're now going on to I should have said next later, but anyway, so this slide is a Mayan calendar, and it's a bit of a myth actually that the Maya were the first peoples to invent the calendar, but they were. Nevertheless, the idea of the calendar is about 2000, dates from about 2000 BC. What struck me about this image, though, which is just a stock photograph from a newspaper, is how the art director had chosen to show a museum object against a sort of starry sky, a background of the cosmos. And you have already here the idea, I think, of non-European cultures as slow changing, as eternal, as lacking the speed and the pace and the zip, and the rhythms of Western innovation. And that's something that has been helpfully critiqued as colonial time, and we drew a lot on Victoria Ravine's writing on that. But perhaps the more obvious point I should make, therefore, is that time itself is a construct, and it's a construct that is quite closely linked to Western trade and therefore to the history of Western empire and colonization. So it was helpful to us to look at the anthology on global fashion by Welters and Lilithan, and they write about the slow arc of change in their book Fashion History, A Global View. So they challenge these dominant discourses that establish fashion as a purely Western phenomenon based on rigid style change that starts in 14th century European courts. And they argue for the measurement of time as a flexible concept for a slower arc of change than in Western capitalist societies. And I'm all for this on one level, but I also have a slight problem with this sort of generously inclusive analysis of cultures as if they're all, if you like, on the same plane, because I think that the idea of the slower arc of change has also to be problematized in terms of the history of empire and the history of colonization, in fact. And we found Homi Bhabha's idea of what he calls the time lag of cultural difference very helpful here, which he discusses in relation to subaltern and post-colonial agency. So the lag for him is not a geographical one, it's a lag in signification, and it enables him to talk about cultural hybridity and new articulations. So I'm aware that's got a little bit dense already, but I just wanted to set it out because it's really important to, I guess, understand that the anthology begins by looking at fashion in relation to capitalist time, that is industrial time, before it goes on to consider the other two models of time that may be either complicit with it or antithetical to it. So next, please. Oh, sorry, can we skip that one and actually move on? Great. So industrial time is very much, I think, about the seasonal nature of fashion as an industry, and it corresponds to the period of post-Enlightenment modernity and 19th century colonial expansion. So next, please. Industrial time, as Anja Kronberg has argued, is also modernist time, and as I said, without it really the fashion industry couldn't have expanded internationally in the 20th century in the way that it did. So it, as Anja points out, fashion begins to acquire this universal temporal framework with time zones, seasonal changes, accurate clocks, all create new technologies and new goods, as well as new tastes and sensibilities. So this previously more local, more diverse and more subjective understanding of time has to make way for the experience and the hustle of modern life. Next, please. Okay, so industrial time, we start with Karl Marx's very excoriating criticism of Western fashion system. He writes not only about unregulated factories, but also home workers like this. He tells the story of the death from simple overwork, he calls it, of a London milliner, and he criticizes what he calls the murderous, meaningless caprices of fashion. And as part of this industrial time or clock time, as the historian E.P. Thompson has argued, really, he says, in mature industrial societies of all sorts, they are marked by time thrift. And he emphasizes how the creation of industrial man went necessarily through the exercise of a time discipline. And we tried really hard to bring those ideas to bear on the idea of fashion production and the global fashion trade. But of course, seasonal fashion long predates industrialization. So next, you can see in the 17th century, oh, sorry, clocking in, next. So we have here a 17th century example of the Mercure Galant, a slide, and next in the 18th century, a number of rapid style changes are marked or catalogued, if you like, by the role of the 18th century fashion magazine in creating a regular biennial fashion cycle. And it's a period of rapid style change that is both reflects a social reality, but partly also creates it. And fashion magazines are very influential in creating what we call today as a fashion calendar. And I don't have a 19th century picture, but in the 19th century, you have biannual collections emerging from the 1860s today, and really that very rigid fashion calendar of showing twice yearly is still to some extent with us. First of all, kind of stipulated and regulated in 1911 by the French Chambre syndicale in Paris. And it's really only been challenged recently, if not completely displaced, by fast fashion. So next, please. And as you know, there's a lot being done on this, but I'm sure, as we all know, it's now possible, and it happens, that you can get a garment in 13 days or indeed far less from the factory to the shop floor. You look at shops like Zara, and it's augmented by new media and new systems of communications that can move faster to support this. And so we have things like see now, buy now in designer fashion, live streaming of shows, and all sorts of late 20th century phenomena that challenged that fashion calendar, but didn't completely overturn it. Next, just quickly to say, of course, I forgot we had, yes, Agnes Rocamora wrote, I think, a really important article on this, which is in the book, or just unfortunately a short excerpt, where she talks about the intensification of speed in this new regime with the rise of new technologies. A new fashion time has emerged, defined by acceleration and immediacy. And although he wasn't writing about it, the writer Mark Fisher, I think, wrote very sensitively and fluently about the way that such changes actually structure human sensibilities, not just methods of communication, but ways of living. So he argued that the new flexibility of this sort of post-Fordist kind of production was, if anything, more pernicious than the old rigidity of Fordist production that it replaced. So he associated flexibility with the deregulation of capital and labor and the casualization of the workforce. And so, as he says, as production and distribution are restructured, so are nervous systems. You know, to function effectively, you have to respond quickly. You have to learn to live in conditions of total instability and precarity. Typically, you find yourself in a series of short-term jobs, etc. And this is probably rings horribly true for many of us in far more privileged, not for me, but for younger people than me in far more privileged positions than factory workers, to whom it also undoubtedly applies. So next slide. I know we're going a bit fast, but just to end this section, of course, there is a kind of backlash of slow fashion and environmental concerns about sustainability. And that also is part of a new articulation, critique of the kind of time regulation of fashion. So I just put in two examples. Fashion Revolution seems to have quite a presence here in London, and Extinction Rebellion's Boycott Fashion Initiative. So I'm going to just, having sketched that really fast, sorry for the breakneck speed, I'm going to just move on to antilinear fashion next, please. I guess if I was summing up the last the last section, the whole question, you might, although we didn't do this in the book, think of it as something like Weber's iron cage of capitalism in terms of the sort of global production. So the second, antilinear fashion, really gives us a very different way of looking at fashion design. Perhaps it looks more at design and less at production, and more at culture and less at economics. But what it really tries to engage with is the kind of antilinear character of the way fashion seems to work. So looking next at two designers, Hussein Shalayan is one designer who has actually used the theme of time a great deal in his work. I've just put in two collections here. The central picture is the goes with the one on the right. It's from the same show. And the next one is Martin Margiela, his exhibition Rotterdam, I think it was, wasn't it? So these are designers who very often make time the theme of their collections. Shalayan uses ideas of archaeology. Margiela tends in his, or has tended to compress, expand, loop, morph, or otherwise play with time to depart from this idea of the linearity of clock time. So the idea of time as fluid is really critical for the definition of antilinear time, which is the antithesis of clock time. It goes beyond the straitjacket of industrial and post-industrial capitalism, including work time, to focus instead on how fashion design can actually represent time, how theorists can think about it, and how photographers can picture it. So the concept is thus helpful for speculating on how fashion design and image making can enable the formulation of alternative models of time due to fashion's proclivity for stylistic quotations, its revivals, its speed, and its mutability. I did really want to talk about, next slide please, about Krakow on photography, who we included in the book at some length. I don't know if I've got time, but I'll try and do it briefly. So Krakow wrote, in 1927, he wrote a long meditation on the nature of photography by describing a magazine cover of a contemporary actress who he snapped at the Venice Lido. And I have to thank Renate here, who very kindly one day years ago went to the archive or the library in Berlin to find this article for me because I wanted the photographs. And what she discovered is the photographs were never reproduced in the paper. They were always in Krakow's head. So I've just put in two from my head. So you have to imagine me speculating a little here. Krakow writes about, very similar to Baudelaire, in fact, in the 1860s, leafing through these fashion plates. Was there something? No. Krakow writes about these images of fashionable women caught in the moment, and both of them, I think, identify the tempo of fashion, the instantaneity of the image. But Krakow also understands the longer trajectory of the image, including its decline. So he establishes, and I can't possibly replicate the subtlety, but he talks about this other woman, the grandmother, who is about 24 at the time of the photograph, which is the 1860s. And he talks about this really dizzying historical relay between her past and her present, which I think can only be understood as an antilinear account of time. And I can't do justice to it. I can just recommend that you read it. It's online. You don't have to buy our book. But it's a very interesting meditation on the relationship between time, photography, and fashion. Very fruitful, and I think hasn't been used enough. So that was one thing that we tried to look at in this. A second thing we tried to look at in this section were really ideas from postmodernism. Next, please. So we thought about quotation aesthetics from the 1980s and 90s. So something like, for example, this Vivienne Westwood design that mashes together, you know, an 18th century stays, 1970s punk, traditional British hunting jackets, a codpiece, you know, any number of centuries and fashion histories morphed together in one design. And scholars like Hal Foster, Charles Jameson, Baudrillard have all emphasized the particular contribution contribution of fashion to the postmodern moment in intellectual history, due to fashion's propensity for parody, pastiche, fragmentation, playing with styles and moments in the way that designers like this can do, and in fashion's nostalgic ambiguity between the old and the new. So very much disavowing the idea of origins, chronology, truth to your origins. Postmodern design is a sort of quintessential example of how designers can play with the antilinearity of time through eclecticism, promiscuous quotation of past styles, and scrambling historical references. So next, please, slide. We also, in this section, and I'm sure a lot of you will be really familiar with this, looked at some theoretical articulations of fashion time as antilinear, drawing very much on writers, mainly on Walter Benjamin, but also Mallarmé, Gilles Deleuze, and Michel Serres. So I'm going to keep this really short, and I've just used Judith Clark's exhibition, Malign Muses, as a way to show you pictorially some of the things, some of the metaphors that Benjamin uses in his writing. I'll just say one thing, though, about him, because I think the concept of antilinear time really owes a lot to Benjamin's writing on history and time, and particularly to his critique of progress-oriented temporal narratives that are typical of post-Enlightenment modernity. So for Benjamin, fashion was closely bound up with temporality due to its ephemeral and changeable nature, alongside its proclivity for promiscuous historical citation. And I think fashion operates in two ways in his writing, as a phenomenon which registers change, but also as a marker of time. So this particular image shows a section of Judith's exhibition where she mounted dresses on mannequins on these enormous turntables that were giant cogs. They're actually the kind of turntables that used to be used in car showrooms. So you can imagine they're big enough to have a whole motor car on them that turns slowly. And she built these enormous rumbling cogs so that the dresses revolve. They were always in motion. And at any moment, two dresses would come into conjunction and then move on past each other without stopping. And it seemed a brilliant illustration of Benjamin's idea of dialectical images. And the term references Karl Marx's 18th Brumaire, and it's very much linked to Benjamin's dialectical model of history, which does require some explanation, I think, to understand its potential offer for fashion historians. But essentially, he rejected the idea of history as a linear narrative of causes and effects, and instead argued for the need to explode the historical continuum. And what he proposed was a form of historical writing that would create a constellation of the historical present and a specific moment in the past. And it's at that meeting point, but of the two mannequins that then move on, and then two other mannequins have a different meeting, that I think is a rather brilliant sort of physical building by Judith Clark of the metaphor by Benjamin. So it's very much an anti-teleological and anti-chronological account of historical events. And I think that's at the basis of his idea of dialectical images, of what he calls constellations of past and present that meet. Next, you can show there are different articulations of the same point. He often used the metaphor of the labyrinth. And here Judith built, as you can see, the black lines on the floor are a labyrinth. And the idea of the labyrinth is that as you walk through it, again, it brings past and present into proximity when they would normally be strung out along a line very far apart from each other. Next. Ideas about the rag picker have been very helpful, which I've used myself, about the rag picker as a kind of the cultural historian, a cultural scavenger, I suppose. And then the last one from Judith's exhibition, the idea of optical and devices as lenses through which you can see the distant past in new ways, in a new form of close-up. So these are all obviously metaphors, but I think helpful to show how a curator could creatively try to build those metaphors to explore some different notions of history and time in fashion. So next, moving on. So this is my last section on uchronic time. Am I doing okay, Renate, for time? Because I was going to spend a little bit longer on this?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I hope that wasn't too much of a gallop. Let me explain what Uchronia is. This picture, incidentally, is of the Marchesa Cassati in one of her many wonderful costumes. This one was made for her by Worth in Paris, and I think it was made for a fancy dress party. I think she may be embodying the spirit of electricity here, but I would have to check that. So a Uchronia is actually a 19th century neologism, and it's a kind of what we call today alternate history. It's where people write novels, for example, about, what if Germany had won the Second World War? How would history have unfolded differently? And a 19th century wrote a kind of type of alternate history like that called apocryphal Napoleon. What if everything had gone differently for Napoleon? So what these alternative histories really are, a kind of speculative fiction. And they came to be described as Uchronia. So really, I think here we are perhaps at our most, if you like, creative, free in departing from any sort of fixed idea of time to think what could be a uchronic time, because it's the closest section of the book, I think, to narrative and storytelling, to telling alternative futures and sometimes rewriting the past in an alternative way. So in a sense, this section gave us the opportunity to think about fashion's imaginary with its capacity for fantasy and myth making, as well as sometimes a very devious retelling of the past, a form of alternate history that asks what if. So it scrambles time sometimes and rewrites history as a kind of fiction. And not always in a very benevolent way, as we'll see. So I think it can be both conservative and progressive, and I'll show you examples of both. But what it gives people is the opportunity to rewrite time and history. Just going back to the etymology, which I should have mentioned, Uchronia is analogous to utopia. So utopia means no place, and Uchronia means no time. And it has some of the same fantastical elements. And just as, a utopia can flip into a dystopia, we also do look at one or two examples of dyschronias. So next, please. The term was actually used by Roland Barthes. This is probably only of interest to Anglo-Saxon readers and writers, but you can see that he uses it in the left-hand text as a footnote in his baffling book. I still find it baffling, Le Système de la Mode. And he says that, in fact, that fashion postulates a uchronia. And very strangely, the English language translators did not use the word uchronia. If you look at the text on the right, I really don't know why, because uchronia is a real word. It's in the dictionary, whereas the word they use, achrony, they actually invented. And I have wondered if that's why the term has gone a little bit under the radar with Anglo-Saxon scholars who tend to read in translation, because the only academic who's written about it has been Patrizia Califato, Italian academic, who I think was actually reading the French original. So she's written interestingly about it. But it's Barthes' use of the term, I think, as a useful starting point. He describes it as a time which does not exist. He said, or it's predicated on a time that does not exist. And in a sense, perhaps one could argue that uchronic time is a sort of privileged time of fashion in that sense. It's only possible time. He writes of fashion as a kind of permanent present that's always disavowing the past, disavowing the moment that's just gone. He says pure fashion, logical fashion, is never anything but an anamnesiac substitute of the present for the past. And my next two slides are going to be examples, one of them Karl Lagerfeld, of people who totally shrug off the past and I think are very much disavowing it. let's have the next quote, actually, one of Carl's Carlisms, of which there were many on his website. And there are other great quotes in the book where he says, I hate history and I don't want to be part of it. I'm totally fed up with it. It's boring. Let's move on. And as he says here, I'm from no generation. I'm part of no group. I'm totally floating. And this is the whole story and why I can survive. So that's the Carlism sort of absolute repudiation of any sort of trace of history in fashion. And obviously a much more nuanced kind of critical analysis of this idea of nowness in fashion, of a kind of eternal present. I think you find in Barbara Vinken's text on Fashion Zeitgeist, the now at the threshold of an immediate future. Fashion is the moment that negates time as durée. I mean, she's coming from a very different place, but I think she's articulating something very similar to that investment in the idea of nowness that you find very often in fashion. It erases traces of time, blots out history as difference by positioning itself as absolute, etc. The promise of eternity, but it's a kind of eternal present. So, next, please. I thought that something like Alexander McQueen's, one of his last shows, Plato's Atlantis, was rather a kind of poetic illustration of this idea of Uchronia as a kind of impossible or a fictional time. It brought me back to the idea of, utopia as no place, because Atlantis is, of course, a kind of speculative, imaginative city that no one can find. And there's a uchronic element in that as well, of a kind of no time, as a nowness or a whenness of this Atlantis, sorry. It's about, I think the concept is about the invention of possible futures based on a rewriting of the past. And next, I mentioned alternate history. I think I want to show you some more down to earth and less lovely rewritings of the past. So next, please. It's far from always utopian. And this is a still from a fashion film made for Burberry. By Asif Karpadia, who's a really interesting documentary filmmaker. But anyway, he made this fashion film, which is like a big budget, sentimental, romantic movie that invents the kind of First World War myth of Thomas Burberry. It's got high-end production values. It's got famous actors. The credits last as long as the film itself. It's had so much money thrown at it, it's not true. And it's very typical, particularly of heritage brands, that they rewrite and reinvent their past because it's a very important part of their sales story. And it consists, so really, I guess what we're saying is that uchronic fashion can consist of the most banal forms of fashion marketing, where these heritage brands reinvent their own past. And Burberry is a very good example because they're a firm that had almost nothing in their archive. And there are other companies like Chanel too that had very little that have been buying up for their archives. So heritage, brand building, marketing, promotion, and trend forecasting, I think, are all part of uchronic narratives in fashion. Next, please. Another example from Gucci. They had a campaign, Forever Now, advertising campaign, and they went back to their archive and they actually found these historical photographs of their own workshops from the 50s. But as we know, most high-end brands don't manufacture, in the country of the origin. They're mostly globally manufactured in less than perfect factory conditions. But these idea of the handmade, the handcrafted, and the artisanal is mobilized time and time again to create these narratives about vintage and the gloss of age. So there's kind of nostalgia that mediates capitalist commodities that is very much part of their story, a kind of manufacture of synthetic memory. And this can take place in trend forecasting, I think, as well, and other commercially motivated predictions. But even in these most capitalist guises, I think uchronic fashion very often moves away from the rigors of linear and antilinear time towards more creative and playful possibilities, albeit still shaped by the exigencies of the fashion industry. So, you know, we looked at texts by Elsa Schiaparelli, by Diana Vreeland, by Anna Piaggi, who play extraordinarily creatively with this sort of fashion narratives. Next, I promised you one dark and dystopian one. It's a horrible slide. I really wanted the 1940s David Lean film of Great Expectations, which has for me a much more convincing Miss Havisham, but I couldn't find one. But it's a wonderful passage in the book, and I really recommend you go back and read it, because although I hate anthologies in a way because they cut text into chunks, they sometimes make you focus in a new way on new bits. And it's a beautiful description where Dickens describes this bitter old woman, you know, who was jilted on the day of her wedding many decades earlier, and who literally stopped the clocks. Her shoe was half on and half off. Her wedding dress is rotting. So we just put that in, as I say, as a kind of example of a kind of fictional, dyschronic kind of description of fashion. Next, please. Again, really changing the narrative. From that, I wish we could have given more space also to Afrofuturism, which is really interesting. There are no pictures in the book, but if there had been, I would have wanted pictures from this film, fashion film by Daniel Obasi, who is a Nigerian fashion filmmaker. I think I might have that date wrong. Anyway, Afrofuturism is a kind of alternate history, but in a very creative way. It's hard to summarize because it crosses so many fields. Most of all, I think music, people like Sun Ra, but also film, and to a lesser extent fashion. So if you look at Obasi's website, you'll see that he references Afrofuturism and Afrocentrism. But I guess it's another articulation of the kind of what if of alternate histories. What if there had not been any European colonization of Africa? How would Africa, the different cultures and societies across the whole of the African continent, how differently might they have developed? It's a nice film, this one, and I think you can watch it on his website. The sort of joke of it is that an alien lands in Lagos, so she's blue, and she has a blue leotard, and she's kind of discovered by these complete fashion victims who go, oh my God, you're really standing out. Come with us, we're going to help you to fit in, and they dress her up in more and more outlandish clothes. So that's the joke of the film. Next, please. I also wanted to, by contrast, to go back actually to talk about the idea of colonial time that I mentioned earlier, because I don't think it would be possible today to make a collection like this Galliano collection on the left that he produced as one of his early collections for Dior. It is a much more Eurocentric vision that fuses that kind of bricolages, I suppose, together very vague references to African culture with European colonial fashions. And I put it in deliberately as a kind of opposite to the previous image of Afrofuturism that I showed you, but they are all narratives about mashing up time differently, I guess. Next, please. I wanted to talk just briefly about the digital. And then one last category about activism, and then I'd like to open it up for discussion. So I chose this Gucci slide because the two models' heads, as sort of cyborg collection, the two models' heads are kind of 3D printed, the heads that they hold in their arms. And the advent of the digital is really central to the understanding of uchronic time because it affords so many new possibilities for storytelling. Through blogging, digital publishing, e-commerce, etc. And I think you could begin to see digital fashion time as perhaps something more like a network or a mesh rather than a sort of linear process. And that's partly to do with the way that digital communications operate. And it's not just a metaphor, it's also a way to describe both commercial relations and symbolic structures. For example, the French artist Edmond Couchot sort of criticizes the uchronic time of hypertext and the internet because he says it's a threat to the permanence of written history, which in the past, he said, has the function of organizing memory and of the corollary of memory, forgetting. So he says digital time instead habituates us to think of a time outside time in which events give way to eventualities. So I hope you can see the way that perhaps some of those ideas you could begin to network to digital articulations of time as being structurally different. So last of all, I wanted to talk, because I mentioned conservative and progressive narratives, I wanted to end on the question of activism and critiques. Next and last slide, please. I have to apologize because I've only got a picture for Bernadette Corporation, and I really wanted to talk about Serpico Naro, who is in the book. So, but I'll just say briefly that Bernadette Corporation is, it's a New York and Paris, or was, New York and Paris-based collective that invented a sort of fictional brand to kind of mock corporations and question Western identity. So crossbred art and fashion. But I think I would like to actually end by talking about Serpico Naro. Maybe we should just get rid of that picture, and I'll just sort of talk to the screen. So Serpico Naro is a fictional fashion designer created by a group of activists in Milan who staged a fashion show in the name of this fictional designer during 2005 Milan Fashion Week. But it was actually to denounce the precarious labor conditions of workers in the creative industries. So there's a wonderful article in Fashion Theory by Ilaria Vanni, and she wrote something short, especially for us for the book, on the same subject. So the name Serpico Naro is actually an anagram of the Italian word for San Precario, who's the patron saint of precarious workers. And Vanni describes all the sort of shenanigans that Serpico Naro gets up to, which is in reality an activist group called Chain Workers. So they get the designer admitted to Milan Fashion Week, and then they get as much publicity as possible through various stunts that they stage throughout the city, including getting up the nose of another group of activists who don't realize that Serpico Naro are themselves activists. So they also get criticized for, I actually forget what, political malpractice. But what Vanni argues, I think convincingly, is that she basically draws on two areas. She draws on design activism and how it's written about by academics, and what she calls critical fabulation, which is storytelling. And she says what it is a speculative proposal for a better way to live and to work in the present and the future. So it involves, she writes, the imagination of fashion practices to come that might still be otherwise. So the intervention of Serpico Naro is a sort of alternate history of Milan Fashion Week that is achieved through activism and intervention rather than through, say, academic writing or other forms of polemic. And what I think is so appealing about this is that, as Vanni demonstrates, Serpico Naro's uchronic temporality gives a voice to Milanese activists and shows how the actions of a fictional character can have real impact through collective action. So I'm going to stop there. I hope that wasn't too much of a gallop, but rather than try to sum up, I think it would be nice to open the discussion to everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Please open your microphones for analog or digital applause for this rich and richly referenced talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you.
And please raise your hands or use the chat to signal that you would like to pose a question to Caroline. I would like to ask a question before sort of we come to the content, more on the methodology of writing this book or co-editing this book, because I gather that time is also a culturally specific construct. So I wonder, I think time is culturally specific as a construct, fashion, but also fashion time. So I wonder how did the collaboration with Alessandra Vaccari work? on that basis?
It was really interesting because it came out. So the Italian book, which is this one, came out of, I had a residency at UAV in Venice, a very, very nice one in 2016. And I was able to teach in English because my Italian is almost non-existent. And Alessandra was a very brilliant translator, actually. So we started, you know, thinking and working together in English. But at a certain stage, the text had to go into Italian. And then I had to sort of sit back, really. And we had a kind of interim sheet. Alessandra introduced me to this wonderful concept called broccolino, which is apparently the sort of hybrid Italo-English spoken by Italian immigrants to Brooklyn in the 19th century. So it was kind of in broccolino for a bit, and I could understand some of the Italian, but then it really drifted into Italian. What we found, and this is a real cultural difference, was when it came to kind of then redrafting it for an English readership and for a British publisher, it's not even so much the ways of thinking about time, it's more just different uses of language, different ways of writing that are so different that you almost can't translate. You almost have to write from scratch, particularly when you have new ideas coming in, you know, about sort of Western-centric ideas or something. But I really noticed the difference. Perhaps this doesn't answer your question, but, you know, between Italian and British ways of writing.
Yeah, thank you.
That's it, sorry.
No, but it does. And just on the back of that, sort of concerning the book publication, there are only 5 figures in the book. You mentioned that, and I think what becomes clear in the talk, how richly you are able to illustrate these concepts of time through the choice of imagery and juxtaposition of these different times and spheres, which is something I think is so strong in your work generally. But how did that decision come about?
It was a very, very pragmatic one. So we, you know, had the contract, had our schedule, our timeline, etc. Partly there are just financial constraints. You already have to pay a surprising amount of money to reproduce these extracts. You know, even from, I don't know, poor old Elsa Schiaparelli, you know, who's long dead and it doesn't go to her, you know, or whoever. So you're on a fairly limited budget, but we also were suddenly on an accelerated schedule because we had our book production and delivery planned. Excuse me, and we then, to our great shock, discovered that Met was going to do its exhibition on time and fashion. And that made us kind of worry that if our book came out right at the end, after the exhibition had closed, it would sort of look like we were copying them. So the publishers said, oh yeah, we can accelerate this for you, but it meant we had to do 5 months work in about 2 months. And we had to work very sort of pragmatically to just get together the images we would. So it was a mixture of cost and time limitations. Plus, I have to say that Bloomsbury in the UK and the US are much stricter about copyrights than the Italian publishers were. So the Italian book does have more. So they work on the legal concept of fair use for the text and the images, which Bloomsbury doesn't accept. So that's why there are a lot more pictures in the Italian one.
You have a question.
Hervé, you have a question.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry, as you can see, fashion is not my field, so it's a very uninformed question. And on the top of that, I missed the first 10 minutes of your.
Don't worry, it's fine.
I was late and for class. But I found really interesting, like when you were connecting, of course, the rise of the fashion industry with the rise of capitalism and showing the workers and this extremely shocking way, I must say,
Yes.
that I was unaware of, in which Gucci reused those images for an advertising campaign. So was it in when 2010?
10 or 11, yeah.
10 or 11, which seems absolutely shocking to me.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, because the issue being of time and fashion, if in the volume you considered this proverbial saying, time is money.
Yeah. Well, we didn't actually say that, but I guess the whole of the industrial fashion section, the first third of the book, is about that. You're right. Perhaps we should have said the obvious. And I mean, in other research of mine, particularly in the mechanical smile, I wrote a lot about things like time and motion studies, and Taylorism particularly, where you have a sort of economy of human motion literally linked to production in ways that are particularly cruel. No, perhaps we should have talked more about that. I have to say it's quite frustrating, an anthology, because you can't put much in. One thing I will say, going back to your point about the Gucci, one of my favorite entries in the book is it's something from the Advertising Standards Authority, which is a British kind of government body, that if you have a complaint about an advertisement, any member of the public can complain to them, and they must investigate it, and they must publish an adjudication. So 2 members of the public complained about a Louis Vuitton advertisement, where they were suggesting these fashion models were kind of, making beautiful leather goods in a sort of authentic kind of 19th century way or something. But what I loved about the Advertising Standards Authority treatment of this was they produce a kind of perfect semiotic analysis of these 2 photographs, these advertisements, which they deem did deceive the public, and they had to be withdrawn. So they can't be shown, and we couldn't show the book, the pictures in our book, but we could show the the text. And I was kind of rather impressed, because it's in the public domain. They archive it, you contact them, they send it to you, you can publish it for free. And it seemed to me rather wonderful that any member of the public could complain about something like that if it's shown in the UK. I don't know how it works in France or in other countries. But the public does have that right to make a formal complaint about a dishonest advertisement. And if it's judged to be dishonest, that's public.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of Gucci, it was less the dishonesty of the advertising that I was concerned about, is that sort of weird glorification of the iconography of
absolutely
the workers.
I agree. And it's very common, I think, particularly
this idea that it's glamorizing labor.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's very, very common. Burberry in London has something called Makers, I think it was Makers Corner or Makers Week. They do exactly the same thing, but they used to get artisans in to actually show their craft during Fashion Week. It's surprisingly common, and it's always the heritage brands.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
I will go for, Ethan, go ahead.
Hi, I just want to say first off, thank you. That was a really interesting talk. I know you mentioned Elsa Schiaparelli a little briefly, and I was wondering if you had kind of looked into her relationship and artistic partnership with Salvador Dali, because especially with his, interpretations of time with all the clock paintings and stuff, I felt like that. I don't know.
I haven't specifically. I mean, years ago, I did write a fashion theory article about her surrealist designs. I didn't look particularly into the relationship with Dali, although she also worked with a number of other kind of surrealist artists, including women artists. But I guess then I wasn't thinking about time specifically. No, that would be another way to go. What I have to say is it now infiltrates everything I write about. It's a bit like a brain worm now, because time is in everything.
Thank you. That's very interesting.
Do we have another question? Or can I go for the moment with my question? Yes, thank you very much, Caroline, for your talk. And you said so many things that it's hard to, I would have too much question. But I was thinking about first what you said about heritage. And this is really interesting because today we have those brands that are dealing with their past, their present, and their future.
Yeah.
And it's interesting how they do. And you talked about Burberry, that they have a big important past, an historical, very good, important history, but they have few archives.
Yes.
But they also need to anticipate because they are really modern and they are still really a big brand today. And for Lanvin, I was thinking about other brands. And Lanvin, this is a big brand at the end of the 19th century. They have one of the most amazing archives, today.
Yes.
But today the brand it's maybe mean, but it's almost nothing. The brand, it's very hard for the brand to sell a lot and to have a good image. So do you think it's because Chanel, it's the same? They have a big past, but not a lot of archives, but they have a lot of money to develop their storytelling.
Yeah.
And so it's and do you think, because the question of time for heritage or department archives is more and more important, and they try to also use archives with the digital tools. So here we have a real connection between the two. And for your book, did you contact this archives department or people to understand how they deal with that?
No, we didn't. I mean, partly because it's an anthology and we were already trying to control so many big themes, and time itself, it's very hard to keep yourself, not to just start writing about the history and the philosophy of time, but to sort of constantly pull it back to fashion and to be thinking, what are the best texts to exemplify the points you're making? So we didn't do any of that kind of primary research. But I have to say, through teaching on the fashion history and theory BA at Central St. Martin's for years, I mean, I've noticed over the years that a lot of the jobs available to those students have been more and more in archives. So, those, obviously they tend to go to British ones, but, there are students of that course who work in, I don't know, Margaret Hull, Marks and Spencer, Burberry, a huge number. So those jobs are being created. Designers are beginning to pay a salary for that. McQueen has, I think, now 2 archivists.
Yeah, we see the same in France. More and more brands, even like Kenzo, they created really recently an archives department because they have been created a long time ago, but it's really a recent prise de conscience for them. So I think it's not easy to reconcile the past, the present, and the future. But in terms of jobs, this is something that I think is this is where a lot of students want to go and try to go, because it's really we have more. There are more and more positions.
I mean, I haven't spoken to any of the companies, so I suppose I shouldn't speculate on their motives. But what I would say is the archivist simply looks after the archive and probably loves their objects. But it's the job of the marketing and the publicity departments to tell those stories with them. So,
but often, in fact, the archive. Sorry.
No, that's all.
And the archivists, most of the time, at least in France, they are under the supervision of the communication head or the marketing head. So sometimes, it's like really the board. It's very confusing because, like for Chanel, there's this big issue on Chanel during World War II, and still today.
Yes, I know.
It's hard because the archivists or historian that have been hired by the department are directed by people from the communication.
Yes. So, no, I imagine it must be, frankly, a really impossible job, as opposed to being a museum archivist.
Yeah, I think this is exactly that. It depends on your profile and your, and knowledge.
I also think their status is often very lowly within the company.
Exactly. Yeah, they are almost no one, because they just, they are not really, and this income are not the best ones, and it's completely, And I will have one question, because it was not really a question. I was also thinking about time in labor, fashion labor, because the media, the time is very important in labor. So do you address this? I don't know did you find text about that? Because in France we talk about the seamstresses, we call them midinettes, because they eat at midi, at noon. So, you know, the time is in their name. It's very important. They arrive at 9, they have a break of 15 minutes, they have a lunch of 45 minutes. So it's really, the time is really important. And plus, they fought a lot for their rights to have more, to work less. And
and oh, go on. Sorry, wait.
No, did you find, because it's, and I was thinking if there were a lot of articles or books on that.
No, and I wish I'd talked to you at the time, because I probably would have put your idea in our introduction. It's a really good one. I've forgotten about the MIDI, you know, but I think what we did write about a great deal, and I worried it's a little bit too long in the introduction, is the very relentless rhythms of the fashion year. And we did talk a little bit about even the idea of the fashion day and the conventions, you know, in journalism and in sort of Vogue in the 20s, you see all these illustrations of appropriate wear, you know, for the fashionable woman has to change 5 times a day in the 19th century, and what's appropriate in the morning and the afternoon and the evening, and how that plays out in the fashion show and stuff like that. But it would be really interesting to do some more work on those sort of micro times amongst the workforce, rather than the actual commercial output, if you like.
Yeah, but it's true that, and I think in some workshop, in some couture houses, there were some rules of you go to eat at 12 to come back at 12:45. So, but I think it's pretty complicated to find the archives. But yeah, it was just an idea like that.
No, it's a great idea, and if you find it, you should do something on it. But no, and I know that, I mean, in the really big houses, I think from the late 19th century, they used to have different sittings at lunchtime, didn't they? So it'd be 12 to 12:30 or 12:30 to 1, because they couldn't all eat at once.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So we need to explore that.
It is. I mean, it is very Taylorist, but I feel I wrote too much about Taylorism already in The Mechanical Smile, so I'm trying to kind of move on, you know.
Yeah, you're right, I think. Thank you very much.
I also have a question concerning this construct of time, because the book opens with this sentence: few phenomena embody the notion of time as well as fashion. And of course, the way fashion is being communicated, being lived, being constructed now, especially in the global West, that's, you know, that's very fitting. But you spoke at the beginning, you know, so interestingly about this construction of time. Is it not the case that, you know, when we go back to Iris von Harpen's notion of time as like a religion, everybody just believes in it, that the fashion industry has not done such a very good job of making us believe in fashion time?
No, I think I agree with you, and I think that was a brilliant quote when you said it. I thought it was so good, because actually, you know, of course, you know, there are lots of different, I mean, both physicists and philosophers write very interestingly about time. But there's something about, you know, obviously we wrote quite critically about the concept of industrial time in our first section of chronological time. But I have to say, in terms of sort of everyday sensibilities, that is probably how most of us experience it, that we have somehow naturalized this kind of artificial clock time. And that's why I really like the Mark Fisher quote, in a sense, that, you know, that how these rhythms of production of bigger kind of economic structures kind of embed themselves in our consciousness, so that it's very hard to divorce yourself. I mean, I love the Iris van Herpen quote, because she's right, but I suppose the point about a religion is if you believe in it, you're kind of in it. You know what I mean? You're not really thinking about seeing yourself from the outside. You're just believing whatever it is you believe.
Yeah. And it has a lot of real, you know, physical outcomes, and has had for a long time. So bringing it right back to, you know, this discussion of slowing down time, of a different seasonality, that's that is so pertinent at the moment, and these different initiatives around Dries van Noten, but also other fashion designers at the moment are really looking at the fashion calendar and talking about slowing down fashion in a more sort of systemic way. It struck me when you were talking that really to change the fashion system, we have to change our perception of time. time and fashion. And I don't know, through your work on this anthology, do you think there's a possibility of doing so?
I think you can do it, Renate, if anybody can. I think it's beyond my capabilities to change a global fashion system. But I mean, I think already there were critiques of it. You know, seasonal fashion is obviously, the seasons in question are, you know, European seasons, really, aren't they? You know, I mean, I think even in the 70s there were critiques, you know, that it didn't have any relevance to, you know, Japan, for example, and to the global south. So those ideas also get rethought. I don't know, because I mean, I think the problem, what would be the challenge to it would be, I'm not being very clear here, how would you make that challenge without it simply turning into a kind of demand simply to sell more, when actually we should be consuming less better maybe, but certainly less. You know, more ethically and less in quantity. But I guess my dilemma with the fashion industry and change is I don't think that works for the fashion industry. It works for ethical citizens. That's my huge sort of impasse, I think, that I'm in.
And at the same time, I think it's in a way you're pointing us right to the core, to the crux of the question. If we don't change our perception of time in fashion, the system will not change.
Well, I suppose that's what the slow fashion movement tried to do. I mean, whereas Extinction Rebellion, I think, was focused more on criticism, slow fashion actually was about consuming differently and more slowly, and was, you know, based on the Italian slow food movement ideas. But, you know, how do you square that with factory production in Bangladesh? I mean, another thing we have in the book that is truly heartbreaking is, you know, there is a kind of time and motion study for making of a T-shirt. And, you know, the most expensive part of the manufacture of a T-shirt is the human labor. In a way, we do slightly answer your question, actually, Sophie, in that sense, because there are these really tailorist breakdowns of literally how many minutes to sew a shoulder seam, how many minutes to cut out, or how many minutes to hem, you know, and your T-shirt gets made, I can't even remember, it's in something like 5 or 6 minutes. But that is meticulously broken down in terms of a sort of economics of production. And, you know, in a way, that's what we're dealing with, is fast fashion, the problems of fast fashion and factory production, very often in the global south. Although some of those, I mean, here in Britain, we now have some similar shocking factory practices in Leicester, in the north of England. So it isn't only, in, if you like, the non-West. Sorry, I don't want to bring it all down.
I was going to say that the title of our talk is Between Despair and Hope, and I think you know, to make change, you start with doubt, and to doubt, you start with questioning. So we've questioned the concept of time, and the industry is openly questioning the concept of fashion time this year. So maybe this is the beginning of doubting and changing. Caroline, thank you so much for your very, very rich and insightful talk, and for sharing your work with us tonight.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. It was nothing but a pleasure. It's called Standard Minute Value, by the way. I just checked.
Thank you.
Anyway, thank you so much.
So thank you all very much for coming. Please give another full round of applause for Caroline.
Thank you.
And if you would like to join us for the upcoming talks in the series, you can contact me or put your contact in the chat. So I will put you on the mailing list. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
Keep safe, and see you very soon. Have a nice evening.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.